And it shows a real big lack of self-awareness that you don't see why it would be a problem for you to treat anyone in the LGBTQ community, for example, because you think that they're going to hell. Like, you don't see that as a conflict is a problem. That's a lack of self-awareness. The fact that you don't see the systemic and kind of intergenerational trauma in America, in the systems, but you're saying that you do treat trauma, like, that's a lack of self-awareness. And those two things are inconsistent.
Welcome back to Grub and Grace, the show where we gently peel back the layers of modern life and discover, surprise, it's mostly duct tape and denial. Today's episode is a light, breezy chat about motherhood in America. If light and breezy includes systemic pressure, cultural gaslighting, and a side of existential dread, we're diving into a fun little contradictions moms are handed daily. Like being told this is the best country to raise a family, while policies, politics, and institutions quietly, or not so quietly, make that job harder, riskier, and a lot more isolating. From the normalization of fear in immigrant communities to the medical system's complicated relationship with women's autonomy, to legislation that seems to think control is a substitute for care. Yeah, we're going there. And because we like our reality checks grounded in actual expertise, I'm joined by a licensed professional clinical counselor and reproductive mental health specialist in Minnesota, who helps us untangle what all this does to the human brain, and specifically to mothers who are somehow expected to hold it all together, while the ground keeps shifting beneath them. So if you've ever felt like the messaging doesn't match the lived experience, you're not imagining it. Let's talk about why. I am Mark Flower, and I am joined today by Sandra.
You did it right the first time. That's okay. I had a supervisor who for years kept saying it wrong, and she knew it, and she kept checking hers out all the time. It's like once you get it stuck in your brain one way, it's hard to unstick it.
I'm just going to keep this in here, but I'll say it again anyway. I'm Mark Flower, and I am joined today by Sandra Maurer. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I know I gave quite a bit of information about you, or maybe just a little bit about you, but could you tell the viewers a little bit about you? And you have a book that you are planning to hopefully publish within the year, hopefully. Yeah. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that too.
Totally. Thanks for having me. I am a reproductive mental health specialist, which basically means I primarily work with individuals and families that are going through fertility treatments, family planning, pregnancy, loss, termination, and early parenting. That's kind of the bulk of that work. And I love that. I went back to grad school to do that. So I work at Minnesota Mental Health Clinics here, and I'm the director of the reproductive mental health clinic that we are in the process of building out. And like you said, I'm writing a book. I'm almost done writing a book called American Motherload, which is about the cultural gaslighting of American women and especially mothers and all these contradictions like you mentioned that, things like motherhood is the best job in the world, but also it's not a job. So stop complaining about it. Things like that. I do live in Minnesota. I live in St. Paul, and I have 3 kids of my own here.
That's fantastic. Like I told you before we hopped on here and started recording was, I hadn't interviewed anybody from Minnesota before now. And then I just recorded with 2 other people from Minnesota. It's all at once, just kind of dump right on here. So, but of course it's kind of apt for the time too, with everything going on with Minnesota. And I'm not entirely sure exactly right now. There hasn't been too much news or social media interest right now as far as what's going on in Minnesota. I think, obviously ICE has kind of backed out a little bit. I know they're still present, but they've kind of backed off, and now they're focusing more on the airports. But of course, this is, right in the heels of the bulk of all that stress that they caused with the nation.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It's everybody's traumatized nationally, but I think at the moment we're especially traumatized right here. So.
Yeah, but Minnesotans, you guys really pulled it together and did and really reacted, I thought, very well with everything. You guys held your ground and really showed the rest of the nation that we shouldn't just sit down and accept what's going on. So, thank you. I don't know if you personally did, what you personally did and everything, but, you are part of the community, and you did, you are a counselor, so you do walk alongside with people. So, Minnesota has done a great job.
Yeah, I could talk about this for a long time, but I know that's not what we're talking about today. So I will just say that I am like super, super proud of Minnesota, especially the Twin Cities communities. My husband and I did a ton of rapid response, like Ice Watch. We were out every day for hours at a time, driving around with whistles, and it's wild. And the way people responded so quickly and in such a Minnesota kind of way. It was very matriarchal. It was very decentralized. The people on these like rapid response calls were always like, "You're doing such a good job taking care of your neighbors. Do you need a break? Go get some water." Right? It was just very encouraging, and I will never forget. Right? It's taught me a lot about care and mutual aid and how to support people in a way I didn't know before, I think.
Well, we definitely saw that in social media. So. Yeah, right on. So, as a reproductive mental health specialist, as well as a licensed professional clinical counselor, you dive headfirst into like the crazy intersection of culture, politics, mental health, and parenthood, which gives a very insightful and unique perspective on what's going on in our world. You cover things like Iran and ICE, and you also break down like harmful theologies and toxic faith practices as they pertain to mental health and wellness and the levels of mass religious psychosis, which is building up in America right now. One of my favorite things about your content that you post are the translations of American evangelicalism. Your level of snark is on point. You absolutely nail the thought process behind evangelical ideologies. It's fantastic.
Takes one to know, right?
When you bridge clinical insight into social media, like what have you learned about how online discourse either validates or distorts mental health experiences? And that could be either with interacting with individuals online or also in sessions.
Yeah. It's so interesting you asked this question, because even just this morning, I was talking with another TikTok therapist who is content creator with a bigger platform than mine about people bringing TikToks into sessions, right? They'll share stuff. And sometimes that's really helpful because, if we're living in a small community or we're kind of isolated or whatever, it can be really validating to see other people talking about your experience, especially things like evangelicalism or coming out of high demand religions. On the other hand, people can be really manipulative and like share a bunch of nonsense that's not really grounded in anything and actually actively harmful. So she was sharing actually with me today a post from a male therapist who was really just spouting a bunch of nonsense about couples therapy that wasn't grounded in research and was really quite harmful to women. And based on, I don't know if you know this book called Love and Respect. It's like a very popular evangelical couples counseling book, and it's absolute garbage. There's no evidence behind it. It's really harmful. And this guy was basically sharing that stuff. So I think it's interesting talking about mental health in TikTok and all those spaces, because there's some people out there that are doing like really helpful work and giving people language for things they maybe didn't have language for. And also we have all of the regular like pitfalls with social media where you have people who maybe don't totally misrepresent themselves as having degrees they don't, but they imply that they are an expert in something. And you have people like Mel Robbins who are like giving terrible relationship advice and all kinds of things like that. So I think, and I wish that some of the videos that I make that I like the most are the ones that don't get the most views, because they're the ones that are probably the most like boring content where I'm just explaining research on things. And the ones that I make that are like when I'm really upset tend to get the most views, which I think is like part of the problem, right? Like the things that are the most sensational or the more extreme, it like motivates people to make more extreme content. But I think that's kind of, it's both, right? It's a double-edged sword.
It certainly is a double-edged sword. And there's a lot of bad takes out there. The book that you mentioned, I thought I had heard about before, but obviously it's probably not in my circle of wheelhouse of what I would normally read. So it probably just kind of fell to the wayside. Yeah, I've got friends like, I went to Evangel, so it's a evangelical, like liberal arts Christian schools, the way they kind of market themselves.
Okay.
But I have a lot of friends that kind of, are very much in this space. Like a lot of my good friends that I made from school are very much so kind of stuck in this, basement of fundamentalism is what, that's what it's been called. And some of these friends have gone off into, counseling, psychology and all that stuff. And some of the things that they espouse sound very damaging to me. There's a friend of mine that I had some back and forth with this past fall, and I didn't even bring anything up. He just kind of jumped right into it. I don't know if he knew kind of my side of things, but started talking about like trans people and how it's psychologically damaging to themselves to call themselves trans and to live a lifestyle like this. And he was throwing a bunch of stuff at me, and I was trying to be like let's think a little bit more about this. This might not be the most healthy thing to approach to go, but he has influence where his practice, actually someone from his practice went to Congress and talked to them about like Colorado laws pertaining to trans people and all this. So it's having real life impact on people when you have this this sort of mindset and ideology, and where sin is always seen as kind of like the core element as this, and you're not able to actually see anything past that. So it can be very damaging.
Yes. I have so many thoughts I'm like, where to begin? Obviously, I grew up evangelical, and like part of my deconstruction process was because I became a mental health provider, or I knew I was going to be, right? And my sister, 2 years ago, announced that she wants to become a therapist, but she is very, very conservative, very fundamentalist, evangelical, kind of in the Christian nationalist space. And so I feel very passionately that this is dangerous, right? Like her approaches to things. There are people still today that believe that mental health is actually demonic possession and will perform exorcisms on people. And some of these people have licenses, which is really scary. And I think the general public doesn't totally know the difference between like what all the licensures are, and they're a little bit different state to state. And then like what a Christian counselor is, what's a counselor who just happens to be Christian, and what's a biblical counselor, right? And those things can feel all really like the same, but they're really not. And they're quite dangerous. Like I know you mentioned when we were talking before about the video that I posted about the guy that's the chair of a graduate biblical counseling program, basically arguing that staying in your abusive relationship is faithful to God, to kind of paraphrase that. And I think those are kind of extreme examples, but there's this trickle down effect where those things are kind of existing in the ethos all over, and we're not necessarily aware of them. There's I think the therapist who brought the Supreme Court case last year to, I think it was from Colorado, actually. And she is arguing that she should be able to perform conversion therapy, which is outlawed in many states. Minnesota, it's outlawed because it's harmful. We have miles of evidence to say that it increases youth suicide and all this stuff. For sure. But she's arguing that it's helpful and she should be able to do it. And if I went and looked at her website, and it looks normal. It looks like a regular therapist website. In fact, there's even some like key trauma-informed words on there. And so if you didn't know, right, and you weren't asking specific questions, you might not even realize going into that office that you're with a person that you might not really be psychologically safe with if you have a certain identity. And I think that is unethical and really problematic.
And it's funny you brought up biblical counseling. Maybe we just go into this next little bit here. So the subgenre called biblical counseling, I wrote in here, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, because I knew you have, but it's defined as a, Christian pastoral approach that uses the Bible as sufficient authoritative guide to address personal, emotional, and spiritual struggles, focuses on heart change and sanctification, becoming more like Christ. By applying scripture to life's problems rather than relying on secular psychology. You've talked about this in your videos, and the guy you talked about, his name was John Street. He's a chair of graduate program in biblical counseling at the Masters University. What's your hot take on biblical counseling? And is biblical counseling, in your opinion, ethically or good or bad combination to have the two of them?
Yeah, I think it's bad. My hot take, that's it. That's the end of the. I think it's unethical, and I've been really trying to dig into this lately. How much of that opinion is my bias? How much of that is my own religious trauma? But I just keep coming back to the conclusion that it's just incompatible. And I think that if you belong to a faith community, there's some very important psychological protective factors about belonging to faith communities, and that having mentorship or guidance from a spiritual leader in your community is great. I think we should stop calling it biblical counseling. And I think that it should be very clear, much clearer than it is to most people, that it isn't mental health counseling. And I've talked to a number of people who don't realize that difference. They don't realize that if I go see a counselor at church, they may or may not have a license and real training. And I think that's very, very harmful. There's a lot of reasons for that, right? But like the goal is basically to make you more Christ-like, not to integrate mental health, right? That's not to empower people, right? It's to sort of make people more obedient, right? Like essentially. And I think, it can't be trauma informed just by nature, because it's ignoring the like institutional, historical, intergenerational, systemic trauma. And we're all going through a ton of trauma. So I think that we need everybody to be trauma informed, like really trauma informed. That's very confusing for people. I've read through a bunch of things from like conservative Christian therapists lately, and there's this emphasis on like personal responsibility, which fits sort of conservative narratives anyway. But that's really antithetical to really good mental health support, right? Because that implies that you don't live in a context in which all of your issues were developed by you, rather than considering all the things that are impacting us. And yeah, like my sister was talking about sending, a family member of ours going to treatment for something. And I said, well, this might involve trauma. We should really look for evidence-based trauma treatment. And she said, oh, well, they asked about trauma. And I was like, I don't give a shit. My dentist could ask about my trauma. Sometimes it's on like a form. It doesn't mean that they are trauma informed or like can treat trauma. Like that doesn't mean anything. And I think that's very confusing for people. And I think people like my sister who are very kind and genuinely likable and genuinely care about people are in some ways just even more dangerous, right? Because sometimes they're not disclosing that that's their orientation, and they're not disclosing that they believe gay people are going to hell. And you might not know that going into like an office. Anyway, that was a long way to say, I think it's unethical. I think it needs to stay in its lane. I think you don't think you get to call yourself a counselor. I think you should say, we provide like spiritual guidance or whatever.
Yeah. And the way to translate that, the personal struggle sort of side of it is, everything that you're struggling with is your sin and therefore it's your fault. Never mind systemic power asymmetries or right. Anything that kind of contributes to the root cause of that. And when you see, of course, sin as being the problem, you're not able to see them as their authentic self of where they are. So, there's plenty that comes along with that. And, it's just such a skewed way of going about counseling and trying to help someone is, if you're blinded yourself, how can you help someone else?
Yeah. Yeah. And, you mentioned really briefly earlier the like amount of spiritual psychosis that I think I'm seeing increase in America. At the very least, the amount of people that are operating in like a cult mindset, which I know is a strong word that people resist a lot, but like genuinely that's happening. You can't be in that and also helping people out of their mental health struggles. Those two things just are incompatible. They don't work. And like one of the ethical requirements, like the National Board of Clinical Counselors, is to practice self-awareness and self-care. And it shows a real big lack of self-awareness that you don't see why it would be a problem for you to treat anyone in the LGBTQ community, for example, because you think that they're going to hell. Like you don't see that as a conflict is a problem. That's a lack of self-awareness. The fact that you don't see the systemic and kind of intergenerational trauma in America, in the systems, but you're saying that you do treat trauma, like that's a lack of self-awareness. And those two things are inconsistent. And I think that you can't practice like biblical literalism and also like help people with radical acceptance and differentiate between real and fiction. I saw one of these Christian directories, like Christian counselor directories. The front page just says reality-based therapy. And I was like, what the fuck does that mean? What is that supposed to mean? Like other therapists are doing not real, like what? That's not like a theoretical, it's not an approach. It's not like a specific treatment. And then they mentioned critical race theory on there. And I was like, that's also not a therapeutic theory or intervention. I was like, what are we talking about? But you wouldn't, but a number of them have licenses, right, and are practicing. And so I think it's weird. I think it's a weird thing.
It's like, why don't we just be honest with it and throw in, great replacement theory and all sorts of stuff like that. And, it gives off very much like, I'm an inerrantist, I'm a, apologetic, I'm, all the above, and but trying to mask it in certain phrases so you don't have to use those terminology that would normally scare people away and be like, I don't know about this. So it's a little deceiving in a way.
It is. It really is. And I think some of it's intentional. I think they don't want people to know that. And I think some of it is just a lack of self-awareness.
Yeah. So you've mentioned on your socials that women can become, in a way, disposable once they've served their reproductive role. There are certain theological frameworks, like those associated with Doug Wilson at worst, and as well as other Christian fundamentalist spaces that emphasize hierarchy, submission, and a rigid gender role. How have you seen these kinds of beliefs impact women's mental health in real lived situations?
This question, when I saw it, I was like, this is so big. This is my book. How do I answer this in
Let's spend the bulk of this here then.
Yeah, I was like, oh my God, how do I answer all of this? And I wrote, I jotted down notes, and they're like paragraphs. I was like, oh my God. Okay.
Nice.
So many thoughts about this. It's interesting because studying religious beliefs and those frameworks and their impact on people's mental health can be kind of tricky, right? Like, we know that there's some psychological protective factors for people that belong to certain religious groups. And we also know that, like, for example, marriages that practice traditional gender roles in a really rigid way, usually religious ones, have much higher rates of interpersonal violence. Right? So we know that there's some clear things that we can measure, but also it's really hard to measure how much of this is positive, how much of this is negative. But I think some of the effects of some of those really rigid things and gender role ideas are more prevalent in the whole American culture than we realize. And I think they really impact women's mental health in particular, right? So what I mean by that, it's interesting, the Love and Respect book that I mentioned earlier, it's a really well-known evangelical couples book, right? I actually picked it up with my husband probably 15 years ago, and we were still very much Christian at the time, and very much we're at church, and we're very much involved in these communities. And even when we picked it up then, we were like, this is a lot of bullshit. This doesn't make any sense. But it's a hugely popular book, right? And it essentially argues for gender essentialism and that men only need respect, women only need love. The love language was written by a Christian counselor, a guy who also has no degrees in therapy or counseling or social work, right? But people love that book, not just in Christian communities, but everywhere, right? And it's based on nothing. We've done studies to see if it's real, and it's not. It's just not a real thing. So this kind of stuff sticks, not just in evangelical communities, not just in Christian communities, but in America as a whole, and probably even past that. And it, when it comes to the reproductive piece, it's in our laws, right? We know we overturned Roe a couple of years ago because of evangelical push to do that, because of these rigid gender role ideas. And what that's done is dramatically increased our maternal and infant mortality rates, right? In states where there are the strictest abortion laws, the suicide rate for women is significantly higher. It's about 6% higher on average. When that decision was leaked, it was leaked before that decision actually came down from the Supreme Court, someone had the foresight to measure GAD-7 and PHQ-9, which are anxiety and depression scales for women of reproductive age in these states where the strictest bans would have gone, these trigger bans were set to go in effect, and significant increase in anxiety especially, but anxiety and depression for women just of reproductive age. So these are not people who were pregnant, planning on becoming pregnant, just people who maybe could be, automatically increase in anxiety. So we're living in an environment generally, just as women and people who can become pregnant, that systematically puts us at a disadvantage and makes us feel secondary, right? I feel like I went on a tangent there. What was the first question? What was the original? Oh, yeah. Impact on women's mental health.
Yeah, the system's never really been on the side of women anyway. If I could just interject here really fast. So back in 2023, there was a UN expert named Reem Al-Salem that warned family courts that are shaped by deep gender bias, especially through ideas like parental alienation, which are often used to discredit women and children reporting abuse. Research showed that when fathers make these claims, mothers are far more likely to lose custody and kids can end up in unsafe situations. There's a writer, Grant Wyatt, that traced the back to a now discredited theory that flips reality. The more a mother or child insists abuse happened, the more they're seen as unstable. So even without the scientific backing, this idea took hold, fueling an industry that protects abusive men. At its core, the system rests on two beliefs that women lie and that keeping a father involved matters more than preventing them. And that the result is that courts don't just fail to protect, they often punish the people trying to keep children safe. So yeah, I thought that was, fitting for this conversation, was this little thing that was going on with that.
Yeah. Yep. The system protects abusers more than we realize, right? In a number of ways. They are really oriented in these traditional, if you want to call them traditional gender roles, right? Like it was legal to rape your wife until what was the year? I want to say it was either early 90s. It was early 90s until the early 90s. That was not a crime because it was seen as something that women, you've already given consent at the very beginning, women owe that, right? And so women feel very much like our bodies are, I'll put it this way. In one of the books that I love, she's talking about sexual assault and she's talking about pregnancy and motherhood, and her male colleague turns to her and says, well, those two things aren't related. What are you talking about? What's the connection? And she said, my body. My body is the connection point between all of that. In all of these circumstances, I'm treated as if I owe things to people and that my body is utilitarian, right? It's to be used for people's purposes. In the book, I talk about the billboard problem, which is now that I live in the Midwest and I lived on the East Coast, this is less, but on the Midwest, you drive around and all these billboards are porn shops and gentlemen's clubs and then anti-abortion ads. And it's the whole mm-hmm. And I find that so fascinating because, first of all, it's all propaganda. There's almost nothing that's accurate on those anti-abortion ads, but
no,
it's nowhere in here are women, right? It's just we need you for this and we need you for that. That's it.
Like The Handmaid's Tale. We just need you to pop out babies and that's it.
Yeah. And I think people are surprised when they become pregnant and go through the system that even in the medical system, they're talked down to. We saw the woman in Georgia who was dead. And because of the law there, they kept her corpse alive to keep a fetus gestating.
That just happened, last year, was it?
Yep. Or it might have been the year before. I can't remember. I know. I think it was
very recent.
Years are anymore. Time is weird. Yeah. And I think that guy I posted the video of yesterday, saying that, staying in an abusive place is being faithful to God, right, sounds extreme, but it's that belief really kind of lives in a lot of places. And women really will internalize. We've been taught to internalize the idea that we're to blame when things don't feel good. I'm not loving being a mother. If I'm not loving my marriage, then I'm to blame for that in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just looked it up. So, the marital rape when the last two states that withdrew from it was 1993. That was Oklahoma and North Carolina on July 5th, 1993. It's crazy that's really not that far away. That long ago, that was when this was the last was taking place on that. But you also posted stuff about the number of women who have gone through judicial trials because of wanting to do an abortion. And because of that, I think it was 300 something women since the fall of Roe v. Wade has I forget exactly what it was, but yeah, they've had to go through law proceedings and stuff like that.
Yeah. 400 women since Roe have been arrested on pregnancy-related charges. And this is one real quick before I talk about that. The other thing that it reminded me of is that it's still illegal to get a divorce in Missouri if you're pregnant. So if you're pregnant, you can't finalize a divorce because that's considered still property of the male partner. So there's still laws like that even after the 90s thing changed. But yeah, about 400 women that we know of have been arrested on pregnancy-related charges. Jessica Valenti does Abortion Every Day. That's her Substack. She's an amazing reporter on this. She's spoken at Congress about it. Typically, these charges are things that they're trying to go after a roundabout ways, right? Technically you shouldn't have been able to get that because that pill came from another state. Some of the laws they're trying to pass to restrict this are you can't give people abortion information or drive a woman to another state to get an abortion. That's illegal. So they'll arrest the mother who drove an adolescent out of state to get an abortion. But because you can't yet officially arrest someone for murder for having an abortion, they've been arresting them for the most part on mishandling fetal remains. So they're claiming that you should have kept your miscarriage in some way. And like, I'll try not to get super gross for your whole audience, but like anyone who's been through a miscarriage, I have, or anything like that, that's not a thing that happens, right? Like you're at home on the toilet, right? And so now that Republicans have introduced this idea of catch kits, which is like they want to make you get this kit to somehow collect your miscarriage and bring it into the hospital or the police so that they don't arrest you. But just recently, that case in Georgia, they arrested her and they are charging her with homicide for her abortion.
So sad that happens.
I know, so much. Yeah.
Well, for women, and I guess honestly, it could be anybody that is raised in a high control or highly prescriptive religious environment. Like, what does the journey of untangling faith from harm actually look like in practice? Like when you have all of this stuff, like how do you see that?
The question is like, how do we start untangling some of this stuff for ourselves? Mm-hmm. I think it's important that we create like enough internal stability to be able to tolerate what happens when we start to challenge some of these long held for most of us beliefs, because it's an unraveling and a grieving process. So it basically creates an identity crisis, because what happens is we're kind of taught things, we ingest things, usually from a really young age. And then there are these points that start to create cognitive dissonance where our lived experience or new information starts to challenge that. And most of the time, these things come up and we find a way to rationalize and we have to dig deeper into whatever we were taught, right? So the like exaggerated example with like MAGA stuff, right, is that like people will be like, well, now he's a pedophile and you said you wouldn't support him if he's a pedophile, and they come up with a reason why. Actually, that's not true and I don't believe that and that's not real, right? So we'll do that to ourselves for a long, long time. And it kind of reaches a critical mass for a lot of us where that cognitive dissonance becomes too great and we no longer can really tolerate digging in back into and rationalizing, and we have to take the risk of like opening up that Pandora's box, because at some point you sort of know, if I pull at this thread, all this other stuff that I believed about myself and the whole world might come crashing down. I think if you find yourself along that journey somewhere, it's really helpful to connect with other people who have done that journey or are on that journey. This is a great place where social media can kind of come in handy, right? There's lots of people talking about this. There's like some books, right? Like I remember in my own deconstruction journey, I read Jesus Feminist like a long time ago. And I found that to be such a helpful, it was like a little hand holding, right? She was like, here, it's okay. You can take one more step in this direction of like really thinking about this. It was like a little bit of permission for me to think about some of the things I had already been thinking about for a long time. And so I think in that like deconstruction process, we really need community support, because a lot of us will be losing an entire community of people behind us, or maybe even partners, right, in that process. Thankfully, my partner and I really kind of went on that deconstruction journey together. And he grew up Catholic and I grew up like Baptist evangelical. So it was slightly different angles that we were coming from. But, thankfully we kind of did that together. But that's not the case for everybody. And so you also know that you might be losing your parents or your partner or whatever behind you. And we need to kind of replace that social anchor in a way. And I think one of the things we do in therapy when people are going through this process is trying to continue to create stability and validating those very real feelings and very real thoughts, and helping people to trust themselves again. Because what happens in high control groups is that you're taught over and over again not to trust your intuition, right? Like that thought you had was actually just your evil kind of self, your like flesh, right? Or even worse, like it was the devil or a demon. And so you're systematically and repeatedly taught not to trust yourself. And so in therapy, that process involves a lot of rebuilding trust in yourself, that like if something feels off to you, it probably is. If this feels harmful to you, it is. And that takes time. It's like rebuilding a whole relationship with yourself.
Oh, yeah. Definitely rebuilding that relationship. That's what therapy's for. That's what counseling is for. Yeah. I do want to go back to, because we talked about like Roe v. Wade and all this. And so throughout the history of America, there have been like great strides in making this country an equitable place for all people. Like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, abolished slavery, even though the 13th Amendment is now used for legal slavery, guaranteed citizenship, and prohibited voting discrimination based on race. The 19th Amendment, which secured voting rights for women. Brown v. Board of Education declared segregation in schools, public schools, unconstitutional. Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Voting Rights Act of 1965 enforced the 15th Amendment, targeting barriers of voting, especially in the South. Roe v. Wade, which we mentioned, protected the rights of pregnant women wanting to choose to have an abortion before the point of fetal viability. Americans with Disabilities Act provided comprehensive civil rights protections for people with disabilities. Obergefell and Hodges legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. Since the overturn of Roe v. Wade in 2022, lawmakers have been gunning after Obergefell, so the same-sex marriage, and more recently, the 19th Amendment, which is women's right to vote. The SAVE Act is essentially a roundabout way to take voting rights away from women. So if the SAVE Act is enacted, which by the time this episode airs, it may very well be, how will this affect women as well as the country at large? And I really, God, hope not that this isn't the case. But
for those of us who pray, please pray. But that's a great list that you made there. We knew when they overturned Roe, they were going to come for Obergefell for sure, right? Roe was really about privacy. It was like a medical privacy act, or a case. So it set that precedent that allowed like marriage and all those other things to be protected. And so I've actually was surprised Obergefell's still here. I thought maybe this summer, but anyway, I'm really concerned about the SAVE Act. And I think that a couple of things. I think that the SAVE Act is exactly how conservative lawmakers and this regime in particular are going about disenfranchising more people. And it's kind of this pattern, right? Like they're not going to show up tomorrow and be like, we got rid of the 19th Amendment. They couldn't. That's like a really long process. They know that, right? Like they're not really interested in necessarily going through this really long process. One, because it's wildly unpopular, obviously. And two, because it takes a long time. The same thing is like they're not going to show up tomorrow and be like, we created a national abortion ban. Even though they have all the branches of government, they probably could. But they're not going to do that because that would create an immediate big pushback. What they do instead is they kind of hollow it all out, right? They can't be like, we instituted martial law in the Twin Cities, even though they effectively did. They just did it in this kind of roundabout kind of way.
It's all about optics.
Yeah. And the SAVE Act is one of those things, right? Where it's like, we're not saying women can't vote. We're just saying you have to have a passport, which also means that people that are low income, half of America doesn't have a passport. Like most people in America don't have passports. They're expensive. They take time to get, lots of paperwork. They're using it as a way to make it harder, right? We're just going to make it harder. We're not going to like say that we're going to make it illegal. We're just going to make it effectively much harder for women to vote. And that was in Project 2025. Like they've been talking about it for a while. And like that list that you gave of all of the things, it's like we had all these successes. And I think that's really hard for us to make. That creates cognitive dissonance, right? I think a lot of us, especially before the last 10 years, like those of us who are old enough to remember that there was a time where we felt really hopeful. We were like, maybe we've done it. Maybe we have like, we're not perfect, but we're going to do it. We're going to like get out of this mess that we are as Americans, and we're going to like evolve, and we're going to be great. And then we kind of realized that, we actually haven't really faced our demons. And I know this is a really long answer to your question, but this is how I think about that list of successes. And then like this absolute disaster we've been living through for 10 years is that, and this is probably because of my therapist brain, but I think of it as like a dysfunctional family that like we were set up with an abuser, and the abuser is white supremacy and patriarchy. We told ourselves that we were like the freest and the best, but like we started off with a genocide and like not everybody was allowed to vote. All men was not all people. And so we really kind of lied to ourselves from the beginning. And we've never really dealt with that. And so because of that, we kind of live with this abuser. And what happens in abusive families is that in those systems, somebody always protects the abuser. Somebody always is like, yep, the status and the status quo is more important. So you're going to report that abuse to me, like we were mentioning the abusers before, the systems that protect them. You're going to report that, and I'm going to pretend that's not happening, or I'm going to deny that, or I'm going to say you're wrong. And so we have, like, in our dysfunctional family, the people that protect the abusers. And then every time somebody tries to set a boundary and gain some space back and say, actually, like, I'm not going to take that anymore. Actually, we've got Roe now. Actually, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. Actually, we do deserve some of this stuff. I am going to set a boundary. It pushes back fucking harder, right? Mm-hmm. The most risky time for people leaving an abusive relationship is when they're leaving it, right? It's right when they say, I'm leaving. That's most often when they're killed by their partners, right? And like, not to go back to this, but the leading cause of death in pregnancy in America is homicide by your partner. So it's a real risk, right? And I think what we're doing right now, like living through right now, is like we pushed back a lot. We had a Black president. We've gotten like more liberal, and the abusers were like, no, absolutely not. We're going to burn the whole thing down before we let you disrupt the status and the hierarchy. And so that's how I think of how do we make sense of all these successes we've had as a country and then all of this falling apart now.
The way I see it is kind of like Star Wars, so I kind of equate it like that. So you get this, authoritative, oppressive regime that has all these things in place, and the rebels come through and they start making victories and whatnot, the blowing up Death Stars and whatnot. And so this whole list of events that I kind of went through, and like those are some of these victories. And then people get complacent. They feel like we're in a good spot. We're making all these victories. They get complacent, and then the First Order comes through and they wreck everything again. So that's kind of how I'm seeing it, based on the way you were kind of explaining everything like that.
I got a rebel loon tattoo.
Nice.
My husband and I got matching tattoos after being in a rapid response for 6 weeks. So I like that. I like that metaphor too. That's a good one. That's a good one to use.
So everything we've been going over, it's just anxiety inducing. And so, I mean, anybody would have anxiety after just, spending 5 minutes on social media and everything. So I think in today's day and age, I think it's apt to sprinkle in a little bit of hope, get that rebellion's hope back up. What can we all do first to protect our own mental health? And second, how do we do our part in stopping or at least slowing down harmful orthopraxy enacted into law?
Good words. I actually think these things are so connected. I think that we can't really do one without the other. And, there's like Black women leadership in the country that have taught us about self-preservation as resistance. And so I think that, and like joy and resistance, and following their leadership. At the very beginning of the podcast today, we talked about this, right? Like why I think the resistance in Minnesota is so effective is because it was a resistance of care. And it was kind of a matriarchal structure, which most people think of matriarchy as like women are in the hierarchy higher, but matriarchal structure is actually decentralized and it focuses on safety and care, mostly for children first. Mm-hmm. And that's what this was. So right? It was built on networks that really were strengthened during George Floyd, especially by communities of color. And then it kind of just quickly expanded. Why it worked is because it was about empathy and it was about compassion and taking care of each other. And it was very confusing for the regime and for ICE agents who see relationships as just in terms of power, right? To encounter strength that was about just compassion and empathy. And so I think that like Audre Lorde, I wrote this down in my notes because I was like immediately think of Audre Lorde, who said, she was a Black author, professor, activist, and she said that self-care is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that's an act of political warfare. So I think caring for ourselves and caring for each other is actually one of the best ways we have to resist. Fascism hates that. Fascism wants hierarchies and power. It does not want us to care for each other. It does not want us to do what we did here, which is like people just show up at the Whipple building and wait for people that are getting dumped out in the street and just drive them home. The story I shared a lot, that one of the ones that was most viewed on social media was about this. And my friend who works with immigrant families, she went in the Signal chat when there was like an abduction in the parking lot. And she said, I need an aftercare team. And in 15 minutes, there were 3 women there. And her friend was like, well, what organization did they come from? And she was like, the neighborhood. Like, we just like this one, the one we're doing right now. Right. And so I think, it's important for us to kind of have boundaries around social media. I'm guilty of like not having them very well myself. But I think even more important than kind of limiting what we're exposing ourselves to is like making sure we're building in even more of like rest and regulation time for our nervous system and co-regulation time, which is like the singing resistance and just being together with people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I had another, sub question to that. It was just how do we, protect the most impacted and vulnerable people by harmful legislation? I feel like you even, kind of covered that a little bit, but I don't know if you have any more insight into that too.
Yeah, I think that it's the responsibility of people who look like us to make sure that we're visible and vocal about it. I think it's really important that we don't get intimidated by the kind of empty threats of the fascist regime. And we continue to speak up on their behalf. And the other part of it is just that very real, tangible empathy. People get frozen in like, what do I do? What do I do? And my advice is always like, get to know the 5 people that live around you if you don't already, and create a signal chat. That is your first step in protecting people, because some of them might be more vulnerable than you realize. And if you don't know that, then you don't know your neighbors well enough. So that, I think it's those 2 things, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to clarify the difference between empathy and sympathy, which empathy has been demonized lately in conservative circles. But, the difference is that they've really been talking about sympathy as opposed to empathy. Empathy is talking about it's about perspective. It's about understanding the other person's feelings or emotional world. Whereas sympathy is feeling with somebody. That's where you can, have affirmation or agreement with, the things that they believe and whatnot. So what they're talking about empathy, they're actually talking about sympathy. And I think there should be a distinction between the two of those, that you don't necessarily need to have sympathy when you have empathy, understanding someone. So I always feel like I need to make that clarification whenever empathy kind of comes up, because it's easy to, if you hear the wrong, the certain people, and not necessarily wrong, but it's just like if you hear certain people's perspective on it, you might not get a very clear answer on what that is. So
yeah, they misuse narcissists. They misuse boundaries all the time. They are always using the word boundaries incorrectly. That's one on social media that I wish I could just like erase. People do not understand boundaries, and they use them, they weaponize it. And the toxic empathy thing that that's come out of evangelical culture in the last few years is wild to me. But also, if we kind of zoom out and look at it from a little bit further back, it makes sense that that's rising up at the same time, because like I said, the thing that resists fascism is empathy and sympathy and collective care, right? So they definitely need people to think that and teach other people that caring too much is a problem.
Yeah, it's all about power and control, and empathy is the kryptonite to their power and control of fascism. So because that leads to sympathy, like you said, it's it leads to people seeing other people's problems and plights and whatnot, and actually wanting to walk with them. So
absolutely.
So I'm going to we're running out of time here. I'll need to step off in just a moment. But if anybody wants to hear more about you, or just hear more of your content, where can they find you?
Yep, my social media handles are MN_therapist, so like Minnesota therapist, and my website is sandrafraziermaurer.com, and that's where like my book info and that stuff will be up.
And seriously, anybody listen to this, like go check her stuff out, and try to find her translations of evangelical.
Those are fun.
Those are fun. You'll get a good chuckle out of them. And also, you have a book that you are in the process of trying to get published as well. I don't know if you want to pitch that again as well.
Yep, it's called American Motherload. Hopefully, it will be published within the year. My Substack is called the same thing, American Motherload. So American Mother -load. Yeah, so that they're the same name. So you can find it there, and I'll put updates about when the book hopefully does get published and where you can get it.
Solid. Sandra, it seriously has been such a pleasure. I love this conversation. You brought up some really good points that I think people need to process and think about and have spoken to them. So really, I appreciate you coming out and spending the time to come out here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun. I loved your questions. I was like, these are such thoughtful questions. I'm excited to talk about them with you, and I hope you continue to kind of get really cool content and keep talking about some of this stuff. I appreciate it.
Right on. Keep rocking on and keep making all the content you do.
You too.